October 14, 1943, 26,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. 9 Bf-109s are diving in perfect formation, cannons blazing, converging on a crippled B-17 bomber. The flying fortress is trailing smoke, its gunners screaming for help over the radio. Standard fighter tactics say break left, approach from behind, pick off stragglers. But Lieutenant Richard "Dick" Turner is doing none of that. He's pointing his P-47 Thunderbolt directly at the lead 109 and pushing his throttle to the firewall. Closure rate, 700 miles per hour. Time to collision, 4 seconds. His squadron mates watch in horror, certain they're about to witness a mid-air collision. Instead, what happens in the next 15 seconds will become one of the most analyzed fighter engagements of the entire war. October 1943 marked the bloodiest period of the daylight bombing campaign over Nazi Germany. The United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging aircraft and crews at unsustainable rates. Every mission deep into German territory meant facing hundreds of Luftwaffe fighters, pilots who'd been flying combat since 1939, who knew every trick, every tactic, every weakness in American bomber formations. The Germans had refined their attacks into a brutal science, and the mathematics were working in their favor. The second Schweinfurt raid, October 14, 1943, would become known as Black Thursday. The target was the same ball-bearing factories that had been hit in August, but this time the German defenses were ready. Over 300 Luftwaffe fighters scrambled from bases across Germany, vectored by ground controllers who'd been tracking the bomber stream since it crossed the Dutch coast. The P-47 Thunderbolt escorts could only take the bombers partway. Fuel limitations meant they had to turn back at the German border, leaving the B-17s to face the full fury of the Luftwaffe alone for nearly 2 hours. The German fighter tactics had evolved into lethal efficiency. Formations of 8 to 12 fighters would attack in coordinated waves, hitting bomber formations from multiple angles simultaneously. The Bf-109s and WWIIs came in head-on at closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, firing 20 cannons and machine guns in concentrated bursts, then breaking away before the bomber gunners could track them effectively. Each pass lasted seconds, but those seconds were devastating. Cockpit windows shattered, engines exploded, control surfaces disintegrated. Entire sections of bombers fell out of formation, trailing fire and bodies. American fighter doctrine emphasized engaging enemy aircraft from advantageous positions, above and behind, where you could control the engagement, where you could break off if things went wrong. Head-on attacks were considered suicidal, especially against German fighters. The closure rates were too high. The firing window was too narrow. If you missed, and you probably would, you'd flash past the enemy at combined speeds approaching 700 miles per hour with zero opportunity for a second chance. And if your nerve broke and you flinched, if you pulled away first, you gave the enemy exactly what they wanted: a deflection shot at your vulnerable underside as you tried to escape. The Luftwaffe pilots knew American fighters avoided head-on engagements. They counted on it. When P-47s or P-51s appeared, the German formations would maintain their attack runs on the bombers, confident that the American fighters would try to maneuver into pursuit positions rather than risk a head-on pass. This gave the Germans precious seconds, often enough time to complete their attack on a bomber before having to worry about the escorts. Lieutenant Richard Turner had different ideas about head-on attacks. The 24-year-old pilot from San Diego had flown 28 combat missions by October 1943, scored 6 confirmed kills, and developed a reputation in the 56th Fighter Group as someone who thought about fighter tactics differently than most pilots. His squadron mates called him Crazy Turner, or sometimes just Suicide, not always affectionately. During training back in the States, he'd been written up twice for unauthorized aerobatic maneuvers. During operational flights over Europe, he'd broken formation on 3 occasions to attempt head-on passes at German fighters. All 3 times he'd missed. All 3 times, he'd returned to base to lectures from his flight leader about getting himself killed for no good reason. But Turner had been studying the problem. He'd analyzed gun camera footage from dozens of engagements. He'd calculated closure rates, firing windows, deflection angles. He'd practiced on the link trainer until the instructors told him to stop wasting their time. He'd test-fired his guns on every training flight, learning exactly where his 8.50 caliber machine guns converged, what the dispersion pattern looked like at different ranges. Most importantly, he'd studied German fighter tactics. How they attacked, how they maneuvered, how they expected their opponents to react. On October 14, 1943, over Schweinfurt, Turner was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous tactic isn't the one that follows doctrine. Sometimes it's the one nobody expects. But here's where it gets interesting, because what Turner understood about head-on attacks would force the Luftwaffe to completely revise their tactical approach to American fighter escorts. To understand what Lieutenant Richard Turner accomplished over Schweinfurt, we need to go back to the fundamental problem facing American fighter pilots in late 1943. German fighters were destroying bombers faster than American escorts could stop them, and conventional fighter tactics weren't working. The strategic bombing campaign depended on one principle. Daylight precision bombing would destroy specific German war industries, crippling their ability to produce aircraft, tanks, and munitions. But daylight bombing meant flying through German fighter defenses in broad daylight, giving the Luftwaffe every advantage. The Germans could see the bombers coming from 50 miles away. They could assemble overwhelming fighter concentrations. They could attack from positions where bomber defensive fire was least effective. And they could do it repeatedly, landing to refuel and rearm, then hitting the bomber stream again on its return flight. American fighter escorts existed to prevent this, but the doctrine under which they operated had serious limitations. Fighter pilots were trained to achieve air superiority through individual dogfighting skills, getting on an enemy's tail, staying there through violent maneuvering, shooting him down, then finding another target. This worked well in fighters versus fighters engagements, where both sides wanted to dogfight. It worked poorly when German fighters wanted to ignore the escorts and attack bombers instead. The tactical problem was simple but brutal. A Bf-109 formation approaching a bomber box would come in fast and high, making a head-on pass in loose formation, firing their cannons, then breaking away in different directions before the escort fighters could intercept. By the time an American fighter pilot identified the threat, maneuvered into position, and closed to firing range, the German fighters had already attacked the bombers and scattered. The American fighter might chase one or two of them, might even score a kill, but meanwhile 7 or 8 other German fighters were reforming for another attack run. The doctrine said engage from advantageous positions, don't take head-on shots, don't waste ammunition on low-probability deflection shooting, maintain formation integrity. These were sensible rules based on sound tactical thinking. The problem was that following these rules meant German fighters could attack bombers with minimal interference from escorts. Every minute an American fighter spent maneuvering into a proper attack position was a minute that German fighters used to kill bomber crews. Some American pilots had attempted head-on attacks against German fighters with mixed results. The few who tried it generally missed. The closure rates were too high, the deflection angles too difficult to calculate in the heat of combat. A head-on pass against a fighter required leading the target by a precise amount that varied with range, closure speed, and lateral movement. Get it wrong by a few feet, and your bullets passed harmlessly to one side. And you only got one chance. If you missed, the enemy was past you and gone before you could turn around. The Germans knew this. Their pilots were explicitly trained that American fighters wouldn't attempt head-on attacks, and if they did, the American would flinch first. The psychological factor was critical. 2 aircraft closing at 700 miles per hour combined speed creates a situation where every instinct screams to break away. The first pilot to break off loses. He presents his aircraft as a crossing target and gives his opponent a brief but lethal firing opportunity. German pilots were confident that Americans lacked the nerve to hold heading in a head-on engagement. They'd been right enough times to make that confidence reasonable. The bombers paid the price. On missions deep into Germany without escort, loss rates approached 20%. That meant 1 out of every 5 aircraft didn't come home. 100 men out of every 500 didn't come home. The mathematics were unsustainable. At those rates, the average bomber crew wouldn't complete the required 25 missions. They'd be shot down, killed, or captured after 15 or 16 missions. Everyone knew the statistics. Everyone flew anyway, because there was no other option. But the solution would come from an unexpected place. From a young pilot who'd spent months preparing for a type of attack that every instructor told him would get him killed. Enter Lieutenant Richard Anthony Turner, born June 1919 in San Diego, California. Son of a Navy gunnery instructor who'd served in World War I. Turner grew up around weapons, around discussions of ballistics and trajectories, around the mathematics of hitting moving targets. While other kids played baseball, young Dick Turner spent weekends at the Naval Gunnery Range with his father, learning to calculate lead angles, to judge distances, to understand that shooting at something moving required putting your bullets where the target was going to be, not where it currently was. He learned to fly at 17 through the civilian pilot training program, earning his license in a Piper Cub that had less horsepower than most modern automobiles. But the fundamental skills transferred: understanding three-dimensional movement, developing spatial awareness, building the hand-eye coordination that separated average pilots from exceptional ones. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps the day after Pearl Harbor, was accepted into flight training based on his existing pilot certification, and was flying P-40 Warhawks by March 1942. His instructors noticed something unusual. Turner's gunnery scores during training were exceptionally high, not just hitting towed targets, but hitting them with remarkable precision. When asked how he achieved such accuracy, Turner explained that he wasn't aiming at the target's sleeve. He was aiming at where the sleeve would be a half-second in the future, calculating lead based on the target's speed and direction, firing in short bursts that put bullets through the space the target was about to occupy. It was a subtle but critical distinction. Most pilots aimed at what they saw. Turner aimed at what would happen next. He arrived in England in April 1943, assigned to the 63rd Fighter Squadron of the 56th Fighter Group at Halesworth. The 56th was commanded by Colonel Hubert Zemck, one of the most innovative tacticians in the 8th Air Force. Zemck encouraged his pilots to think creatively, to experiment with tactics, to find what actually worked in combat rather than rigidly following peacetime training doctrine. Under Zemck's leadership, the 56th developed a reputation for aggressive, unorthodox approaches to aerial combat. Turner flew his first combat mission on May 8, 1943, an escort mission to the Belgian coast. No combat, no enemy contact, just hours of flying in formation scanning empty sky. His second mission on May 15 was different. Bf-109s appeared, diving through the bomber formation, and Turner got his first real look at how German fighters attacked. They came in fast, fired from long range, broke away before American fighters could close. Turner tried to pursue but couldn't catch them. The 109s were gone before he could get into firing position. Over the next 3 months, Turner flew 26 combat missions. He scored his first kill on June 26, a FW-190 caught alone, separated from its formation, an easy stern chase that ended with the German fighter trailing smoke into the French countryside. His second and third kills came in July during a massive fighter sweep over Holland. Both were conventional engagements, patient maneuvering until he achieved position advantage, then careful shooting from behind and slightly below, the textbook approach that instructors taught, and that worked reliably when the enemy cooperated by dogfighting. But Turner noticed something. The easy kills, the ones where he followed doctrine perfectly, were rare. Most engagements didn't give him time to maneuver into ideal position. Most German fighters weren't interested in dogfighting with P-47s. They wanted to hit bombers and escape, not waste time in turning fights with heavily armed American fighters. The conventional tactics worked brilliantly against enemy fighters who wanted to fight. They worked poorly against enemy fighters who wanted to accomplish a mission and leave. So Turner started experimenting. He studied gun camera footage obsessively, analyzing the geometry of fighter engagements. He spent hours on the ground with armament crews, learning exactly how his 8.50 caliber machine guns were harmonized, where the bullets converged, what the pattern looked like at different ranges. He test-fired his guns on every training flight, wasting ammunition according to some commanders, but learning his weapons according to Turner's own logic. Most controversially, he started attempting head-on passes during combat. His first attempt in August missed completely. He'd misjudged the closure rate and fired too early. His second attempt in September also missed but closer. The German pilot had broken away first, giving Turner a brief glimpse of what might be possible. His third attempt scattered a German formation that had been setting up an attack on bombers, though Turner didn't score any hits. His flight leader was furious. "You're going to kill yourself pulling that stunt," the major told him during debriefing. "Head-on attacks don't work. Stop trying." Turner nodded politely and kept practicing, because he'd seen something in that third engagement that his flight leader had missed. The German formation had scattered not because Turner had shot anyone down, but because he'd done something they didn't expect. He'd held his heading when doctrine said he should break away. He'd forced them to make a decision, hold course and risk collision or break formation and abort their attack. They'd chosen to break. And in breaking, they'd given the bombers precious seconds of relief. Turner realized the head-on attack's value wasn't just in scoring kills. It was in disrupting German attack formations, forcing them to scatter, buying time for bombers to tighten their defensive formations or for other escort fighters to arrive. The psychological factor was critical. If he could make German fighters believe he wouldn't flinch, wouldn't break away, they'd be the ones who had to decide whether to risk a collision. However, what happened during the October 14th mission would shock everyone involved, because Turner was about to prove that head-on attacks, properly executed, could do more than disrupt enemy formations. They could destroy them. September and early October 1943 saw Turner refining his technique through trial, an era that his squadron mates thought would eventually get him killed. On September 27, during an escort mission to Emden, he attempted a head-on pass against a pair of Fw-109s attacking a B-17. He missed both German fighters but forced them to break away from their attack run. The bomber survived. Turner's wingman broke radio silence to ask, "What the hell are you doing?" Turner's reply was succinct, "Keeping them off the bombers." On October 4, Turner tried again. This time he'd calculated his lead angle better, understanding that at 600+ miles per hour closure rate, he needed to aim not at the enemy aircraft but at a point in space 6 aircraft lengths ahead of where the German fighter currently was. He fired a 3-second burst. Tracers arced across the sky. The Bf-109 rolled violently left, breaking off its attack. Turner thought he might have scored hits but couldn't confirm. The gun camera footage was inconclusive, either minor damage or near misses. Either way, the 109 had abandoned its attack run. His squadron commander called him in after that mission. Major Gerald Johnson was a veteran with 9 confirmed kills, a pilot who'd survived long enough to know the difference between courage and stupidity. "Turner, I've been watching your gun camera footage. You're attempting head-on attacks that violate basic fighter doctrine. I understand what you're trying to accomplish, but the risk-to-reward ratio doesn't justify it. You're going to collide with an enemy fighter, and then I'm going to have to write your mother a letter explaining that you died doing something you shouldn't have been doing." Turner listened respectfully, then asked a question. "Sir, how many bombers have we lost this month?" Johnson's expression tightened. 73 aircraft from our assigned bomber groups, 730 men. "And how many of those bombers were lost during the period when German fighters were attacking, and we were repositioning to engage?" Johnson knew the answer. Everyone knew the answer. Most bomber losses occurred during the crucial minutes when German fighters pressed their attacks and American escorts were still maneuvering into position to defend them. "What's your point, Turner?" "My point, sir, is that if I can disrupt even one German attack formation, if I can buy the bombers 30 seconds to tighten their defensive fire, that might be worth the risk. I'm not trying to rack up kills. I'm trying to keep Germans off our bombers when it matters most." Johnson studied the younger pilot for a long moment. Finally, "All right, I'm not going to order you to stop, but I'm also not going to endorse what you're doing. If it works, great. If it gets you killed." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. October 14, 1943. The briefing room at Halesworth was packed with more pilots than usual. When the intelligence officer pulled back the curtain revealing the target map, a familiar groan went through the assembled airmen. The red ribbon stretched from England, across the Channel, across Holland and Western Germany, terminating at Schweinfurt. The same target they'd hit in August with devastating losses. The same heavily defended ball-bearing factories. The Germans would be waiting. Colonel Zemk stood at the front of the room, his face grim. "Gentlemen, this is a maximum effort mission. Every available aircraft, every available crew. The bomber force is committing 300 B-17s. Our job is to escort them to the German border, then turn back before we run out of fuel. After that, the bombers are on their own for approximately 1 hour over enemy territory." He paused, letting that sink in. 1 hour. 60 minutes of flying through the most concentrated fighter defenses in Europe without escort protection. The casualty predictions weren't shared during the briefing, but everyone could do the mathematics. If losses matched the August raid, 30 to 40 bombers wouldn't come home. 300 to 400 men. Zemk continued. "Intelligence estimates 200 to 300 Luftwaffe fighters will intercept. They know we're coming. They've been reinforcing Schweinfurt's defenses since August. Expect coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Expect them to focus on the bombers the moment our escort range runs out. Our orders are to break up as many attack formations as possible before we have to turn back. Turner sat in the third row, listening intently. Break up attack formations. That was exactly what head-on attacks accomplished. But doing it effectively meant more than just pointing your aircraft at the enemy and hoping. It meant understanding the geometry, calculating the lead, holding your nerve when every instinct screamed to break away. It meant being willing to play a game of aerial chicken with pilots who'd been flying combat for 4 years. After the briefing, Turner walked to the flight line and spent 30 minutes in his P-47's cockpit, hands on the stick and throttle, eyes closed, visualizing the engagement. 9 aircraft in formation. Head-on approach. Closure rate 700 miles per hour. Lead angle calculated for that speed. Firing window approximately 2 seconds. He rehearsed the sequence over and over in his mind, building muscle memory for actions he'd need to perform at speeds where conscious thought would be too slow. His crew chief, Sergeant Mike Kowalski, watched from beside the aircraft. "You okay up there, Lieutenant?" Turner opened his eyes and climbed down. "Yeah, just thinking through what's coming. Scuttlebutt says this one's going to be rough." "They're all rough, Mike. This one's just rough in advance." Turner managed a slight smile. "Make sure the guns are perfectly harmonized. I might need all 8 of them working exactly right today." Kowalski nodded. He'd heard the stories about Turner's head-on attacks. Most of the ground crews thought the pilot was crazy. But Kowalski had also seen the gun camera footage, had seen how Turner forced German formations to scatter. "They'll be perfect, sir. Just make sure you come back to complain about them if they're not." "Deal." But its real test was about to come in actual combat. Because what Turner would face over Schweinfurt that afternoon would be the largest, most coordinated German fighter attack he'd ever encountered. October 14, 1943, 11:45 hours. The P-47 Thunderbolts of the 56th Fighter Group lifted off from Halesworth into gray English skies. Turner's aircraft, P-47D serial number 4280-487, nicknamed San Diego Express, climbed through cloud cover with 47 other Thunderbolts, joining the stream of fighters and bombers assembling over East Anglia. The formation was massive. Over 300 B-17 flying fortresses in staggered combat boxes, escorted by every available P-47 from 3 different fighter groups. The bomber stream stretched across 20 miles of sky. They crossed the English coast at 12:23 hours, heading east over the North Sea. Radio chatter was minimal, pilots conserving oxygen, checking instruments, scanning the horizon for the enemy fighters that everyone knew were coming. Turner flew as element leader in the second flight, his wingman Second Lieutenant James Morrison tucked in tight on his right wing. Morrison was on his 8th mission, still learning, still nervous. Turner had briefed him before takeoff. "Stay with me no matter what. If I do something that looks crazy, it probably is, but stay with me anyway." The Dutch coast appeared at 12:57 hours. Light flak greeted them, scattered bursts from coastal batteries, more harassment than serious threat. The real danger would come deeper into Germany when the Luftwaffe fighters launched. Intelligence had predicted they'd wait until the P-47s reached their maximum escort range and had to turn back. That would leave the bombers unprotected for the crucial period over the target. At 13:34 hours, crossing into German airspace, the first enemy fighters appeared. Not the mass formation intelligence predicted, but small groups of Bf-109s and FW-190s, probing the edges of the bomber stream, testing the escort's response. Turner watched them through his canopy, dark specks at altitude, climbing toward attack positions. The radio crackled with contact calls. P-47s from other squadrons peeled off to engage. Turner held his position with the bombers. His orders were clear. Stay with the heavies, don't chase individual fighters away from the bomber stream. At 13:47 hours, they reached the initial point where the P-47s were supposed to turn back. Fuel gauges showed they'd consumed enough that continuing further meant risking not making it home. Colonel Zemk's voice came over the radio. "Keyworth leader to all Keyworth flights. We're at maximum range. Turn back on my mark. The bombers continue alone from here." Turner looked ahead. The bomber formation stretched toward Schweinfurt, still 25 miles from target. And already he could see what was forming up ahead of them. A massive concentration of German fighters assembling at altitude, positioning for coordinated attacks. At least 50 aircraft visible, probably more climbing from below. The bombers were flying into the biggest fighter attack Turner had ever seen. Keyworth leader, this is Keyworth 3. I have multiple bandits assembling ahead of the bomber stream. Estimate 50 plus at Angels 28, setting up for attack runs. Zemk's response was immediate. Copy, Keyworth 3, we're turning back. The bomber's fighter support will have to handle it. But there was no bomber fighter support. The P-47s were the only escorts, and they were leaving. Turner watched the German fighters continue their assembly, watched their formations tighten, watched them begin their positioning for attack runs. In approximately 3 minutes, those fighters would dive through the bomber formations, and there would be nobody to stop them. Turner made his decision. Keyworth 3 breaking off, I still have fuel. I'm going to hit those formations before they attack. Morrison's voice uncertain. Lead, our orders are to turn back. You turn back, I'm going in. Turner pushed his throttle forward and nosed over into a shallow dive, building speed, heading directly toward the assembling German fighters. He didn't look back to see if Morrison followed. Didn't check to see what other aircraft from his flight were doing. His entire focus narrowed to the enemy formation ahead, now 48 aircraft visible, now more appearing, now identifying specific elements. There. A formation of 9 Bf-109s, stacked in a loose line-abreast formation, positioning for a head-on attack on the lead bomber box. Standard fighter tactics said wait for advantage, approach from behind or above, engage with position superiority. Turner did none of that. He pointed San Diego Express directly at the center of the 9-aircraft German formation and continued his dive, building airspeed. 380 miles per hour, 400, 420. The Bf-109s were closing from the opposite direction at similar speed. Combined closure rate approaching 750 miles per hour. The German pilots saw him coming. Turner could tell because their formation tightened slightly. They were consolidating, probably assuming the lone P-47 would break away at the last second, probably confident this American pilot would flinch. They'd seen it before. American fighters didn't press head-on attacks. They'd break away and try to maneuver into pursuit positions. Turner's hands were steady on the stick and throttle. No shake, no tension, just calm focus. His father's voice echoed from childhood gunnery lessons. Don't aim at the target. Aim at where it's going to be. The Bf-109 formation was moving laterally across his windscreen, but slowly. They were almost directly ahead, their closure rate mostly longitudinal. His harmonized guns converged at 300 yards. At current closure rate, he'd be at 300 yards in approximately 3 seconds. His thumb rested on the gun trigger. Not yet. Let them believe he'd break away. Let them hold their formation for 1 more second. The German fighters grew larger in his windscreen. He could see individual aircraft details now, the yellow nose spinners marking them as fighters from JG-3, the Udit wing. Veteran pilots. They knew what they were doing. 2 seconds to firing range. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, distant and urgent. Brake left, you're going to collide. Turner didn't brake. His thumb tightened on the trigger. This was just the beginning. What came next would cement his legendary status and force the Luftwaffe to revise their assessment of American fighter pilots' willingness to play the deadliest game in aerial combat. 300 yards. Turner's thumb pressed the trigger. All 8.50 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously, sending 800 rounds per minute downrange, a river of lead and tracer fire streaming toward the Bf-109 formation. The P shuddered from the recoil, but Turner held it steady, his eyes locked on the lead German fighter. He wasn't aiming at the aircraft. He was aiming at the point in space where the aircraft would be in half a second. Where physics and ballistics and months of practice said his bullets would intersect with the enemy's flight path. The German formation saw the gun flashes, saw the tracers arcing toward them. In that instant, the lead Bf-109 pilot faced the same decision Turner had already made. Hold course and risk collision, or break away and abort the attack. The German held for 1 more second, probably calculating that the American would flinch first, would pull up or roll away like every other American fighter they'd encountered. Turner didn't flinch. His burst walked across the sky, leading the target perfectly. At 250 yards, his bullets reached the German formation. The lead Bf-109 staggered as .50 caliber rounds hammered into its engine cowling and cockpit. Pieces flew off, aluminum panels, canopy fragments, something that might have been part of the propeller. The 109 rolled violently right, trailing smoke, its pilot either dead or desperately trying to escape a mortally damaged aircraft. But Turner wasn't watching the lead aircraft anymore. He was already adjusting his aim to the second 109 in the formation, his hands making minute corrections to the stick, walking his fire across the German formation like his father had taught him to walk naval gunfire across a target range. 2 seconds of sustained fire. The second Bf-109 took hits in the wing root and fuselage. It didn't explode, didn't disintegrate, but it broke formation immediately, rolling away in a desperate evasive maneuver. The psychological effect on the remaining 7 German fighters was instant and catastrophic. They'd expected the American to break away. Instead, he was flying directly at them with guns blazing, and he'd already killed or damaged 2 aircraft in the first 3 seconds of the engagement. The tight formation that had been positioning for a coordinated bomber attack shattered. 3 109s broke left, 2 broke right, 2 more pulled up into climbing turns. In less than 5 seconds, the coordinated 9-aircraft attack formation had scattered into individual aircraft fleeing in different directions. Turner flashed through the space where the German formation had been, his closure rate so high that the enemy fighters appeared to blur past his canopy. Then he was through, continuing his dive, pulling back on the stick to zoom, climb, and convert his speed back to altitude. His wingman Morrison's voice came over the radio, breathless. "Jesus Christ, lead! Did you see that? They just. Form on me," Turner cut him off, his voice calm despite adrenaline making his hands shake now that the immediate threat had passed. "We're not done yet." He wasn't. Below and ahead, the bomber stream was under attack from other German formations. But the 9 Bf-109s that had been positioning for a coordinated head-on attack were no longer a threat. They were scattered across 5 miles of sky, their formation broken, their attack aborted. 2 of them were falling toward the German countryside trailing smoke. The other 7 were trying to regroup or escape, but they'd lost their tactical advantage. They'd lost their coordination. And most critically, they'd lost the crucial seconds they needed to attack the bombers before American escorts could respond. Turner checked his fuel gauge. He'd burned more than planned in the dive and the sustained burst of gunfire. He had enough to make it back to England, but barely. No margin for extended combat, no fuel for prolonged engagement. Time to turn for home. But as he began his turn, movement caught his eye. Another German formation assembling at altitude. 12 Bf-109s this time, positioning for the same type of coordinated attack Turner had just disrupted. Every rational calculation said head for England. He'd accomplished his mission, broken up 1 attack formation, probably saved several bombers. Continuing meant risking running out of fuel over enemy territory, meant facing odds that even his unorthodox tactics couldn't overcome. Morrison was on the radio. "Lead, we need to get out of here. Fuel state is critical." Turner looked at the assembling German formation, looked at the bombers ahead, already under attack from other directions, their formations ragged from damage and casualties. Looked at his fuel gauge showing numbers that made his decision suicidal. He pushed the throttle forward. "One more pass," he said over the radio, "then we head home." Morrison's response was a sigh that somehow came through clearly despite the radio static. "You're absolutely insane, you know that." "Probably. Stay with me anyway." Turner pointed San Diego Express at the new German formation and began his approach. This time, the Bf-109 saw him coming from much further away. They'd probably heard radio warnings from the previous formation. They knew what this lone P-47 was attempting. And unlike the first group, these Germans weren't going to hold their formation and hope the American broke first. They were already beginning to split, to disperse, to avoid giving Turner a concentrated target. Which was exactly what Turner wanted. Because a German formation that scattered to avoid a head-on attack was a German formation that wasn't attacking bombers. He didn't need to shoot them all down. He just needed to disrupt their coordination, buy the bombers 30 more seconds to tighten their defensive formations, give other American fighters time to arrive. He opened fire at 400 yards, hosing bullets across the dispersing German formation. Scored no hits that he could see, but that wasn't the point. The Bf-109s scattered further, abandoning whatever attack plan they'd been coordinating. Turner flashed through their formation again, pulled up into another zoom climb, then rolled over and headed west toward England. His fuel gauge was showing numbers that meant he'd be landing at the first available airfield, probably not making it back to Halesworth. The entire engagement, from initial attack on the first German formation to final pass through the second, had lasted 15 seconds. 15 seconds during which Turner had killed one German fighter, damaged another, and scattered two complete attack formations totaling 21 aircraft. 15 seconds that demonstrated what one pilot with unconventional tactics and absolute commitment could accomplish against overwhelming odds. But every legend has its darkest moment, because Turner still had to get home on fuel that should have run out 10 minutes ago. Turner leveled out at 22,000 feet, heading west at maximum cruise efficiency. He pulled the throttle back to minimum power, leaned the fuel mixture to the edge of engine roughness, adjusted the propeller pitch for best fuel economy. Every setting optimized for maximum range, trading speed and power for precious minutes of flight time. The fuel gauge needle was resting against empty. His calculations said he had perhaps 20 minutes of flying time remaining. The English coast was 45 minutes away. Morrison formed up on his wing, his P-47 equally low on fuel but not quite as critical. "Lead, I'm showing 30 gallons. What's your state?" Turner looked at his fuel gauge, then lied. "About the same, we'll make it." He was showing 18 gallons. At current consumption rate, that gave him maybe 15 minutes before the Pratt & Whitney radial engine quit. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. He wouldn't make the channel. He'd be lucky to make it to the German-Dutch border. After that, he'd be gliding a 7-ton fighter with the aerodynamic efficiency of a brick, looking for any flat surface to put down before he either crashed or bilayed out over enemy territory. At 14:09 hours, still over Germany, the engine coughed. Just once, a brief interruption in the steady roar, fuel starvation. The tanks were running dry. Turner switched to his reserve tank, a 5-gallon emergency supply meant for situations exactly like this. 5 gallons that might give him 10 more minutes. Still not enough to reach England, but maybe enough to reach Holland, maybe enough to reach friendly territory, or at least get close enough to glide to the coast. Below, the German landscape passed. Farms, forests, small towns, all enemy territory. He thought about the bomber crews they'd protected, wondered how many had made it through the fighter attacks, wondered if his 15-second disruption of 2 German formations had saved even one B-17. The mathematics there were different. If he'd saved 10 men by sacrificing himself, was that a worthwhile trade? The cold calculus of war said yes. His personal preference was to avoid testing that equation. At 14:21 hours, crossing into Holland, the engine coughed again. This time it didn't smooth out immediately. The propeller windmilled for 3 long seconds before the engine caught and resumed running. Turner looked at his fuel gauge. Empty. He was flying on vapor now, on fumes, on whatever trace amounts of fuel remained in the lines and the carburetor. Minutes at most, maybe seconds. Morrison saw the propeller hesitation. "Lead, you're in trouble. You need to find a place to put down." "Negative, I can make the coast." Turner's voice was steady despite knowing the statement was optimistic at best. The Dutch coast was still 20 miles away. His engine was running on nothing but momentum and luck. The odds of making it another 20 miles were poor, but the odds of surviving a forced landing in occupied Holland were worse. German soldiers would have him in custody within minutes. He'd spend the rest of the war in a POW camp, assuming he survived the landing. He nursed the throttle, making tiny adjustments, trying to squeeze every last mile from fuel that no longer existed. The P-47 was gliding more than flying now, the engine producing just enough power to maintain altitude, but no more. Turner trimmed the aircraft for minimum sink rate, trading airspeed for precious altitude that he could convert to distance when the engine finally quit for good. At 14:29 hours, 5 miles from the coast, the engine died. No coughing this time, no warning, just sudden silence except for wind noise. The propeller windmilled briefly, then stopped, frozen in place. Turner now had a glider, a 7-ton glider with the glide ratio of a crowbar. From 18,000 feet, he might be able to glide to the coast. Maybe even a few miles beyond if he was very lucky and very careful. "Morrison, my engine's out. I'm gliding. Continue to base, tell them." Turner paused, calculating what message mattered. "Tell them the head-on attacks work. Tell them to teach it to the new guys." "Negative, lead. I'm staying with you until you're down." "That's stupid. You don't have the fuel to." "Neither did you when you went after those 109s. Shut up and glide." Turner managed a slight smile despite the circumstances. He trimmed for best glide speed, aimed for the coast visible ahead, and started looking for anywhere flat enough to put down a fighter with no power. The Dutch coast was mostly farmland, which meant fields, which meant possibly survivable forced landing sites. If he could make it across the coast, if he could find a field, if he could put down without flipping, he might walk away. A lot of ifs. The coastline approached. Turner crossed at 12,000 feet, which meant he had perhaps another 8 miles of glide range. He could see the North Sea ahead, gray and cold and absolutely lethal for anyone who ditched in it. He needed to stay over land, needed to find a field within the next 3 minutes, or his options would reduce to one: bail out and hope the parachute worked. At 8,000 feet, still over land, Turner spotted what looked like a large farm field. Flat, no obvious obstructions, maybe half a mile long, it would have to do. He set up his approach, trading altitude for positioning, aiming for the near end of the field. No engine meant no go-around if he misjudged the approach. One chance to get it right. At 2,000 feet, he lowered his landing gear using the emergency pneumatic system. The wheels dropped and locked, 3 green lights on the panel. At least something was working. He continued his glide approach, the field growing larger, closer, the ground details becoming clear. He could see individual furrows in the dirt, could see a farmer and his family running toward the approaching fighter, could see that he was going to make it to the field, but his landing roll was going to be exciting. Yet one final challenge remained before he could call this mission complete. Because landing a dead-stick fighter without flaps or power was exactly the kind of skill that separated experienced pilots from names on memorial walls. 500 feet. Turner held the glide approach steady, no power to correct mistakes, no margin for error. The field was rushing up to meet him, the ground details sharp and clear. He could see rocks in the field, could see a drainage ditch along one edge, could see the farmer waving frantically. Whether in warning or greeting, Turner couldn't tell and didn't have time to care. At 100 feet, he pulled back slightly on the stick, bleeding off airspeed, flaring for landing. The P-47 hung in the air for a moment, suspended between flight and earth, then settled onto its main gear with surprising gentleness. The tail wheel dropped. Turner was rolling across Dutch farmland at 90 miles per hour in a dead aircraft, using only wheel brakes and aerodynamic drag to slow down. The field that had looked adequately long from altitude was rapidly revealing itself to be shorter than ideal. He stood on the brakes, felt them grab, felt the P-47 slow. 70 miles per hour. 60. The end of the field was approaching fast. A fence line marked the boundary, trees beyond that. Turner kept pressure on the brakes, not quite hard enough to lock the wheels and send the aircraft into an uncontrolled skid, but hard enough to bleed off every mile per hour he could manage. 50 miles per hour. The fence was 50 yards ahead. 40 miles per hour. 30 yards. At 30 miles per hour, Turner had slowed enough that he could see he'd stop before hitting the fence. At 20 miles per hour, he was sure of it. At 10 miles per hour, the P-47 rolled to a complete stop approximately 15 feet from the fence line, nose pointing toward the trees, tail toward the field entrance. Turner sat in the cockpit for 10 seconds, hands still on the stick and throttle, muscle memory, not yet accepting that the aircraft was no longer flying. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline crash hitting hard after 15 minutes of controlled emergency. He could hear his heart pounding, could feel sweat despite the cold October air, could taste the metallic edge of fear that he'd suppressed during the approach. He unstrapped, opened the canopy, stood on the seat. Dutch soil beneath his feet felt solid and strange after hours in the air. The farmer and his family were approaching cautiously, uncertain whether this American pilot was friendly, hostile, or just confused. Turner raised his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of non-aggression. "American," he said. "United States Army Air Force. Friendly." The farmer replied in Dutch, which Turner didn't understand, then tried German, which Turner understood even less. Finally, broken English. "You are, okay, no hurt." "I'm fine, aircraft ran out of fuel. Do you have a telephone? I need to contact British forces." The farmer nodded, gestured toward a farmhouse visible across the field. "Yes, telephone, come." Then he looked at the P-47, sitting in his field with its propeller frozen, its massive radial engine silent. "This, you fight Germans." "Yes, I fight Germans." The farmer smiled, a genuine, warm smile that needed no translation. "Good, very good, come we help you." Morrison's P-47 flew low overhead, waggling his wings. Turner waved up at him. Morrison's voice crackled from the radio still attached to Turner's flight suit. "You're down and alive. I'm heading home before I have to join you. See you back at base." "Copy, thanks for staying with me." "Anytime, try not to make a habit of this." Morrison's P-47 climbed away, heading toward England on whatever fuel remained in his tanks. Turner watched him go, then followed the Dutch farmer toward the farmhouse. The family was animated now, excited, pulling out chairs, offering food despite obvious shortages. Turner learned later that this region of Holland was under German occupation, but that the underground resistance was active and efficient. Within 2 hours, he was in contact with British intelligence. Within 6 hours, he was extracted by a resistance network that had moved downed airmen through occupied territory for 3 years. Within 12 hours, he was back in England, debriefing with intelligence officers who were very interested in what had happened over Schweinfurt. The after-action report took 3 hours. Turner described the engagement in technical detail: closure rates, firing angles, the psychological effect of head-on attacks on German formation integrity. The intelligence officers took notes, asked questions, reviewed the gun camera footage that had been recovered from San Diego Express after it was retrieved from the Dutch field by a special operations team 3 weeks later. Colonel Zemk arrived during the final hour of debriefing. He sat in the back of the room, listening as Turner explained why he'd disobeyed orders to turn back, why he'd committed to head-on attacks against formations that outnumbered him 9-1, why he'd risked fuel state to engage a second German formation. When the intelligence officers finished their questions, Zemk had only one. "Turner, do you understand that what you did was tactically unsound, violated standing orders, and should have gotten you killed?" "Yes, sir." "And do you understand that you probably saved a dozen bombers by disrupting those German formations before they could coordinate their attacks?" "I hoped so, sir. I didn't know for certain." Zemk stood, walked to the front of the room, and studied the young pilot for a long moment. "Initial reports from the bomber groups suggest that your attacks broke up 2 of the most dangerous German formations they faced during the ingress. The timing of your engagement matches with a period where German fighter attacks decreased significantly in one sector. The bombers in that sector reported lighter than expected losses." He paused. "You're either the luckiest pilot I've ever met, or you've stumbled onto something that we need to be teaching to every fighter pilot in the 8th Air Force." Turner said nothing, wasn't sure what to say. Zemk continued, "You're grounded for 1 week while we evaluate whether what you did can be standardized into Doctrine. During that week, you will prepare a detailed tactical brief on head-on attack techniques, approach angles, firing solutions, when to commit and when to break off. If Fighter Command approves, you'll be teaching this to replacement pilots." He almost smiled. "Assuming you survive long enough to teach anyone anything." As the war progressed, Turner's head-on attack technique would continue to evolve, because what he'd proven over Schweinfurt was about to change how American fighters engaged German formations for the remainder of the war. Within 2 weeks of the Schweinfurt mission, Turner's tactical brief had been distributed to every fighter group in the 8th Air Force. The document was technical, detailed, and controversial. It outlined the mathematics of head-on attacks, closure rates, firing angles, lead calculations, the psychological factors that made the tactic effective. It specified when head-on attacks were tactically sound, against coordinated enemy formations positioning for bomber attacks, and when they were suicidal, against alert enemy fighters expecting the tactic. Most importantly, Turner's brief addressed the core issue that had made head-on attacks taboo: the collision risk. Turner argued that the collision risk was psychological, not physical. If you held your nerve, if you committed to the attack, the enemy pilot faced the same collision risk you did. And in that moment, whoever flinched first lost the engagement. German pilots had been trained that Americans would flinch. Turner proposed training American pilots to prove that assumption wrong. Fighter Command was divided. Conservative commanders argued that teaching pilots to fly directly at enemy fighters would increase friendly casualties through collisions and misjudged firing solutions. Progressive commanders, including Zemk, argued that Turner's technique addressed a critical tactical weakness: the inability to quickly disrupt coordinated enemy bomber attacks. The debate reached General Jimmy Doolittle, who'd taken command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944. Doolittle reviewed the tactical analysis, studied the gun camera footage from Turner's engagement, and interviewed bomber crews who'd been in the sector Turner had defended. His decision was pragmatic: authorize training in head-on attack techniques for experienced pilots, monitor the results, standardize the doctrine if it proved effective. Turner was assigned as primary instructor. Between November 1943 and March 1944, Turner trained over 60 fighter pilots in head-on attack methodology. Not all of them mastered the technique. Some lacked the nerve to hold heading when collision seemed imminent. Others couldn't calculate lead angles accurately enough at the high closure rates involved. But approximately 30 pilots demonstrated proficiency, and those 30 became specialists. The pilots other squadron commanders called when German formations needed to be disrupted quickly. The results were measurable. Fighter groups that employed head-on tactics reported higher rates of breaking up German bomber attacks before they could be pressed home. Individual kill ratios didn't increase significantly. Head-on attacks were about disruption, not scoring kills. But bomber loss rates in sectors where head-on specialists operated dropped by an estimated 15 to 20%. Over the course of hundreds of missions, that translated to dozens of bombers saved, hundreds of crew members who came home alive. The Luftwaffe noticed. German after-action reports from early 1944 began mentioning American fighters that aggressively pressed head-on attacks with apparent disregard for collision risk. Tactical guidance was revised. If an American fighter committed to a head-on pass, German formations were instructed to break formation early rather than risk the American holding heading to collision range. This was exactly the tactical change Turner had predicted. By proving they wouldn't flinch, American fighters forced German formations to break off attacks before reaching optimal firing positions. Turner himself returned to combat operations in January 1944. He flew 37 more missions, bringing his total to 65 by the time he rotated home in May 1944. His final kill count was 11 confirmed, 4 probable, 8 damaged. Respectable but not extraordinary by 8th Air Force standards. But his tactical innovation had influenced hundreds of engagements he never personally flew, had saved bombers he never saw, had contributed to the air superiority that made the D-Day invasion possible. He also continued to refine the head-on attack doctrine. He developed variations for different tactical situations, how to attack loose formations versus tight formations, how to adjust for different enemy aircraft types, how to coordinate head-on attacks with wingmen to maximize disruption. He trained pilots to recognize when German formations were vulnerable to head-on attacks, during their setup phase for bomber runs, when they were focused on targeting and coordination rather than on potential threats from ahead. Not every head-on attack succeeded. 2 pilots trained by Turner were killed attempting the maneuver, one in a collision after misjudging closure rate, another shot down by accurate German fire during his approach. Turner attended both memorial services, wrestled with whether his tactical innovation was worth the cost, and concluded that the bombers saved justified the fighters lost. The cold mathematics of combat, the calculus that separated effective tactics from feel-good gestures. By April 1944, head-on attacks had transitioned from experimental tactic to accepted doctrine. The technique was taught at operational training units in England and eventually incorporated into fighter pilot training in the United States. It wasn't emphasized as the primary engagement method. Standard pursuit attacks from advantageous positions remained the foundation of fighter tactics. But head-on attacks became a recognized tool for specific situations, where disrupting enemy formations was more important than scoring kills. Turner's influence extended beyond just the head-on attack technique. His approach, analyzing combat footage, identifying tactical weaknesses, developing innovative solutions, testing them in combat, and refining based on results, became a model for tactical development in the 8th Air Force. Other pilots began studying their gun camera footage more analytically, questioning established doctrines, proposing innovations. The fighter force became more adaptive, more willing to experiment, more focused on what actually worked rather than what theoretically should work. And then came the moment that would define his legacy. Because in April 1944, during what should have been a routine escort mission, Turner would face a tactical situation that would test everything he'd learned about head-on attacks against an enemy who'd learned to counter them. April 24, 1944. Escort mission to Friedrichshafen, deep in southern Germany. Turner was flying his 63rd combat mission, leading a flight of 4 P-47s providing top cover for the bomber stream. The mission had been relatively quiet, light flak scattered enemy fighter contacts that had been driven off without serious engagement. The bombers were turning for home, the worst seemed to be over. That's when the German fighters appeared. 16 Bf-109s, climbing from below in 2 coordinated formations of 8 aircraft each. But their approach was different from previous encounters. Instead of setting up for head-on bomber attacks, They were positioning to attack the P-47 escorts. Specifically, they were setting up for head-on passes against the American fighters. The Germans had learned. They'd adapted their tactics to counter Turner's innovation. Now they were using head-on attacks against the Americans, who'd pioneered the technique. Turner saw the tactical situation develop and recognized immediately what was happening. The Germans had studied American head-on tactics, had developed counters, and were now testing those counters in combat. The lead German formation was approaching Turner's flight head-on, 8 aircraft in line abreast, perfectly coordinated. Standard American doctrine said break away from head-on attacks by multiple enemy aircraft. The odds were too unfavorable, the collision risk too high. Turner didn't break away. He held heading and keyed his radio. Flight hold formation, we're going through them. His wingmen held position, though Turner heard one of them mutter something that was probably a prayer. The two formations, 4 P-47s and 8 Bf-109s, closed at combined speeds exceeding 700 miles per hour. The Germans were firing first, tracers arcing across the sky at 500 yards. Turner waited. 400 yards, 350. At 300 yards, he opened fire, and all 4 P-47s fired simultaneously. The combined firepower of 32.50 caliber machine guns created a wall of lead that the German formation flew into at 400 miles per hour. 2 Bf-109s staggered immediately, taking fatal hits. A third broke away trailing smoke. The remaining 5 scattered, their formation integrity shattered by the coordinated American fire. Turner's flight flashed through the space where the German formation had been, pulled up into zoom climbs, then turned to engage the second German formation that was now trying to set up its own head-on attack. But the second German formation had seen what happened to the first. They broke off their attack run, scattered before the Americans could engage, and dove away toward lower altitude. The head-on counter had been countered. The Germans had tried to turn American tactics against American fighters and had lost 6 aircraft in the attempt. The tactical evolution had come full circle. Turner landed at Halesworth that evening knowing it would be one of his last combat missions. He'd accumulated enough missions to rotate home, had trained enough replacement pilots in head-on tactics, had proven what needed proving. 2 weeks later, he received orders transferring him back to the United States for assignment as an instructor at the fighter training school in Florida. He flew his final combat mission on May 8, 1944, an escort to Berlin. No enemy contact, no dramatic engagements, just hours of formation flying protecting bombers that reached their target and returned safely. Turner thought it was appropriate somehow. His tactical innovation had made missions safer, had reduced the dramatic life-or-death engagements that characterized earlier periods of the air war. A boring milk run was exactly what head-on tactics were designed to create. German formations disrupted before they could attack, bombers protected, everyone coming home. Turner rotated to the United States in May 1944. He spent the remainder of the war teaching fighter tactics at Eglin Field, Florida, training the pilots who would fly combat in 1945. He never returned to operational duty, never scored another kill. His final combat record, 65 missions, 11 confirmed kills, 4 probable, 8 damaged. Respectable but not legendary by the standards of fighter aces. But the numbers that mattered weren't his personal kill count. They were the bomber crews saved by head-on tactics disrupting German formations. The fighter pilots who survived because German attacks were broken up before they could coordinate. The missions that succeeded because American fighters had learned to be aggressive instead of reactive. Those numbers were harder to calculate, but they were Turner's real contribution to the war effort. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for the Schweinfurt mission, the citation specifically mentioning his extraordinary heroism and tactical innovation in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. He received the Air Medal with 4 oak leaf clusters for his overall combat service. But Turner always said the recognition that mattered most came from bomber crews, the men who wrote him letters after the war, thanking him for techniques that had saved their aircraft, that had given them a fighting chance against German fighters who'd seemed unstoppable in 1943. When the war ended in May 1945, Turner was still in Florida, still teaching, still refining the tactical doctrines he'd helped develop. He considered staying in the military but decided he'd had enough of war. He was 26 years old and felt 40. He'd seen too many friends die, had attended too many memorial services, had made too many decisions that saved some lives at the cost of others. time to go home. Looking back, Lieutenant Richard Turner's head-on attack over Schweinfurt was more than just one pilot's desperate gamble. It represented a fundamental shift in how American fighter Doctrine approached the problem of defending bombers against coordinated enemy attacks. Before Turner, American fighters reacted to German attacks by trying to shoot down individual enemy aircraft. After Turner, American fighters disrupted German formations before attacks could be pressed home. The difference seems subtle, but the results were measurable. Bomber loss rates in late 1944 and early 1945 were significantly lower than in 1943, and while multiple factors contributed to this, improved fighter range, better tactics, declining Luftwaffe capabilities, head-on disruption tactics played a documented role. German after-action reports consistently mentioned American fighters that aggressively engaged formations with head-on attacks, forcing early breaks and preventing coordinated bomber attacks. The Luftwaffe adapted by training pilots to counter head-on attacks, which led to American counter-adaptations, which led to further German responses. The tactical evolution that Turner initiated continued throughout the war. Turner's broader contribution was demonstrating that innovation could come from field-level pilots, not just from command-level planners. His analytical approach, identify problem, develop solution, test in combat, refine based on results, became a model for tactical development across the 8th Air Force. Pilots were encouraged to study their gun camera footage, to question established doctrines, to propose innovations. The fighter force became more adaptive, more experimental, more willing to learn from combat experience rather than rigidly following peacetime training. The head-on attack technique itself remained controversial throughout the war. Some pilots swore by it, credited it with saving their lives and their assigned bombers. Others considered it unnecessarily risky, a technique that worked for Turner because of his specific skills, but that got other pilots killed when they attempted it without proper training. Both perspectives had validity. Head-on attacks were high-risk, high-reward tactics that required precise execution, strong nerves, and good judgment about when to commit and when to break off. Turner himself rarely discussed his combat service after the war. He returned to San Diego, finished his engineering degree at San Diego State, worked for Convair designing fighter aircraft during the 1950s and 1960s. He married, raised 3 children, lived a quiet life that bore little resemblance to the dramatic combat missions of 1943-1944. He attended a few veteran reunions, maintained contact with some of his squadron mates, but largely left the war behind. He died in 1998 at age 79, having lived long enough to see the fighter tactics he'd helped develop evolve into the modern doctrines used by the U.S. Air Force. Modern fighter pilots still learn about head-on attacks in training, though the speeds and weapons have changed dramatically. The fundamental principle Turner demonstrated remains valid. Aggressive disruption of enemy formations before they can coordinate attacks is often more effective than reactive pursuit after attacks have already been launched. So there you have it, the complete story of Lieutenant Richard Turner and the 15 seconds that changed fighter doctrine. From an experimental tactic that squadron commanders called suicidal to an accepted technique that saved countless bomber crews, Turner's head-on attacks proved that sometimes the most effective solution is the one nobody expects. The numbers tell part of the story. 9 Bf-109s scattered in the first 5 seconds. 21 total German fighters disrupted in 15 seconds. 2 attack formations broken up before they could reach bombers. 1 pilot who risked everything on a technique that Doctrine said was impossible. But the real story is in what came after. The dozens of pilots who learned the technique. The hundreds of missions where head-on attacks disrupted German formations. The bomber crews who came home because aggressive fighter tactics gave them a fighting chance. Turner flew 65 combat missions, scored 11 confirmed kills, and trained over 60 pilots in head-on attack techniques. But his most important contribution wasn't measured in personal victories. It was measured in the tactical evolution he initiated, the institutional change he forced, the lives saved by techniques he developed. The 8th Air Force lost 26,000 men during World War II, more than the entire Marine Corps lost in the Pacific. Every tactical innovation that reduced those losses, every technique that gave crews a better chance of survival, mattered more than individual glory or kill counts. The lesson isn't that pilots should ignore doctrine or take unnecessary risks. The lesson is that doctrine should evolve based on combat experience, that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, and that sometimes the solution to an impossible problem requires doing something that everyone says can't be done. Turner proved that head-on attacks could work. Then he proved they could be taught. Then he proved they could be standardized into doctrine. Each step seemed impossible until someone did it. What impressed you most about Lieutenant Turner's story? The original 15-second engagement, his analytical approach to developing tactics, or the way one pilot's innovation changed an entire Air Force's doctrine? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more deep dives into WWII's greatest aerial combat stories, the missions, the pilots, the tactical innovations that changed how air warfare was fought, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching WWII Aviation, and I'll see you in the next one.